Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Betrayer for PC. This is a first-person shooter developed by Black Powder Games and released in March of 2014 exclusively for PC, and it's interesting for a couple of reasons. The first of which is the very unique art style, which I will get to when I get to the presentation, because unfortunately I could only capture a clip of it if I used Fraps, and the frame rate went all wonky when I tried to record it with that, and it ended up with a gigantic video file. So obviously I wasn't going to do the entire video with a crappy frame rate video with some humongous file sizes. So I'll instead use that clip for illustrative purposes when I get to the presentation bit. But for the time being, just know that this has a very unique art style that I would love to show you if the recording software wouldn't screw up the colors when I actually tried to record it. The other interesting bit is that this is apparently made by former Monolith developers who worked on the likes of Shogo and Fear, who decided to go indie, and what they made is a product that you don't really see much of. I mean, you don't really see a lot of stuff set in the new world, particularly with a first-person shooter, because, let's face it, muskets aren't really the most entertaining weapons to fire in a game. So let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out how it all works out. Well, as far as presentation goes, your visual experience is going to vary wildly depending on how you set up the colors in this game. If you go completely monochrome, what you're going to find is that the game takes place in black and white, as you're seeing in this clip here, and certain things are highlighted in red, which makes it a very striking art style that is also pretty damn good at developing a sense of atmosphere. But if you turn up the color saturation, then you're going to see a very vibrant, bright, colorful environment that's still decent at generating atmosphere, but it's not really generating the same kind of atmosphere. You see, this game isn't really meant to be all bright and colorful and happy or anything like that. In fact, it's actually supposed to be more dark and ominous and mysterious, and if you have it in the monochrome mode, then that is actually a really good way of maintaining that atmosphere. Not to mention, you do get the feeling that the game was really meant to be played in monochrome, even though it does have the option to turn up color saturation, and it looks pretty good with that. I mean, the visuals themselves, depending on what you're looking at, range from either competent, like the first-person stuff, to downright fantastic, like the environments. I mean, just look at how incredibly lush the environments are in this footage. You can very easily see that there are tons of trees, tons of vegetation, and the wind will occasionally blow through this environment and actually move that vegetation accordingly. It's a really great effect, and when you combine it with the sound design, you end up with some absolutely fantastic atmosphere, because there's really not much in the way of music in this game, and what little there is used very effectively. But normally when you're running around, there is no music at all, and instead you are just listening to basically your own footsteps, the sounds of whatever weapons you're using if you have to use one at any given point, and the sounds of the environment, which is occasional birds, things like the wind rustling through the vegetation, and that's pretty much it, really. And it works brilliantly for what they're trying to do, which is create this kind of sense of wrongness. That idea that there's something really weird going on in this particular area, and that you don't really belong there. Unfortunately, they don't have any voice acting to try to immerse you in this world further. Instead, all of the conversations that you run into in this game are done entirely through text. That's not really a deal breaker unless for some baffling reason you just absolutely despise reading text, which I guess isn't really a problem unless you've just been completely spoiled by modern games voice acting everything. So this one does kind of stand out in the crowd, but generally speaking, the presentation itself is very well done, even though some of the things in it aren't exactly the best. For example, the texture quality is not amazing. It's solid enough, but it's not amazing. The first-person animations are fairly awkward in a lot of spots. I mean, for example, the bow just barely draws when you draw it, and the various guns that you're using don't reload properly. Instead, they just have really bizarre, quick reload animations, I guess to speed things up. But if you know anything about how those actually function, then it ends up just looking not right. But those are not really significant problems. It's just minor annoyances that you can really get past pretty easily. But of course, what really matter here are the story and the gameplay, and this is where I have to warn you, there will be some spoilers in this particular part of the review. That is because it is literally impossible to avoid some degree of spoilers when talking about how this game actually plays and, of course, what's going on. Now, with that warning out of the way, you show up on the shore of a new world colony. I believe it's set in Virginia somewhere. And as you start exploring, you find that something just feels incredibly wrong about the place that you're at. There's nobody around. I mean, there's these forts and other settlements around and nobody's there. There are these weird ash figures in certain spots, and you find very quickly that there's a bunch of Spaniards running around, and they don't seem normal. In fact, they seem very supernatural. And you find out very quickly that there are some weird supernatural things going on, and your objective is basically just to explore and find things at your own pace, really. Now, there are some things you need to do to progress, but the game pretty much just lets you figure that stuff out on your own, and while that may seem kind of awkward at first, because the game basically explains nothing other than how the basic gameplay mechanics work, it's actually not that big of a problem because the game is actually fairly intuitive in how it handles all of its exploration. You see, you're running around, you're exploring, you're finding these Spaniards all over the place, you occasionally fight them, of course, and you find these weird totems scattered around that are shrouded in corruption. You're not entirely sure what that is. And in the first area you come to, you find that the area is actually blocked off by this corruption. So you're like, okay, well, what do I need to do to progress beyond this point? And that's where the more interesting parts of the game kick in, because that's when you begin your supernatural investigations. You're basically trying to find out what exactly happened to the colony and how you can even get out of there in the first place. And along the way, you meet a maiden in red, who of course suffers from some degree of amnesia. She doesn't remember who she is. And while I won't spoil any of that particular part of the game, what I will spoil to some degree is the earlier supernatural investigations, and that's because it's kind of impossible to avoid spoiling it when you're talking about how it works. The basic idea is that you just go around and you find various clues scattered all over the place, like, say, some remains, or you find something that you need to dig up, and you do so, and you find that it's some trinket that might have held some value to a certain person. And so, in the course of your investigations, you will of course be talking to these various spirits and wraiths, and those clues will come in handy to figuring out exactly what happened to them, why they are the way they are, and such like that. And those parts where you are investigating what's going on really are the best parts of the game, because it does just let you loose to explore the game at your own leisure and get as much out of the plot as you really want to. I mean, the actual plot to the game is relatively thin when you get down to it, and the ending itself is really going to be a hit or miss for you depending on how invested you were in the plot to begin with. In my case, it worked, but then the game went into free roam mode after that, and I was like, this doesn't feel right. The game just should end right at the ending instead of going into free roam afterwards. It's one of those weird gaming conventions, because this is technically to some degree an open world game, and I guess it's expected of them to have a free roam mode of some description, but since you only have a single save file, what ends up happening is you either go into free roam to basically just go around and collect all the chests that you didn't collect beforehand, or the notes that you didn't manage to collect over the course of the game, and that's pretty much it, really. Once you get past the investigations, there's really not all that much interesting stuff to do in the game, because that's really the entire meat of it. Apart from that, what you're dealing with is a fairly straightforward first-person shooter where your weaponry is all fairly primitive by modern standards, simply by nature of it being the 17th century, so the 1600s, and you are dealing with bows, crossbows, muskets, and single-shot pistols for the most part. And you do also get tomahawks that you can throw at things for a lot of damage, and you can also throw grenades at things if you have them to do a lot of damage over an area, or a lot of damage to a single target if you're throwing it directly at it. But while the tomahawks and the grenades are bound to just a quick throw button, the actual weapons themselves only have 3 slots, and you can carry a large number of them, but they each have their own stats. So you'll have, say, a crude short bow, which is not as good as a common short bow, which is not as good as a, say, exceptional short bow, so on and so forth. And so you're going to be upgrading your weapons over the course of the game, and this is done both through finding unique weapons that are hidden throughout the world, as well as finding a bunch of loot that you can then spend on purchasing those upgraded weapons from the shops that are scattered throughout settlements. Now, you can sell things in your inventory at any time, and this is particularly helpful if you find something you don't really want. So say, for example, you find a crossbow and you aren't really keen on using crossbows. You can sell that, probably for a large sum of money if you have found a unique one especially, and then you can spend that loot on purchasing the weapons that you actually want, or say upgraded quivers or upgraded shot packs that will give you more ammunition for your main weapons. Along with the weapons, you're going to find charms scattered throughout the world that will give you passive bonuses, things like extra health or upgraded damage for melee and quicker melee or quicker reload speeds and things like that that really do help you out in the long run. But this does come with a pretty significant downside. Early on in the game, when you got the really crappy gear, you're going to find that fights can often be kind of punishing. But when you get to the end game, it's pretty much effortless, because then you've got pretty much the best weapons in the game, you've got plenty of ammo for them, you've gotten used to how they handle, because, I mean, you do have to compensate for projectile drop with the arrows and crossbow bolts, as well as the tomahawks and the grenades that you're throwing, so that is something to keep in mind. But once you get used to how that all works, it becomes pretty easy to score headshots pretty constantly, and to prioritize your targets to the ones that you really need to take down quickly, as opposed to just kind of flailing around like an idiot. And of course, the enemies are bound to the same weapon constraints that you are, so they can actually shoot arrows at you and they will go sailing over your head if you manage to duck over them just barely, or they will fire their musket and then they have to do a fairly slow, laborious reload to actually be able to shoot again, so that gives you a pretty good opportunity to get in there and take them down before they can do that. But this does have a detrimental effect on the atmosphere when that does happen, because you find that the enemies don't really pose as much of a threat to you as they used to, and so you're not really as unnerved by them showing up anymore. But that's really the only major downside that this game has. I mean, sure, it's a very significant downside when you get down to it, but the game is actually short enough that it really doesn't become that big of a deal. It's about 5 to 6 hours long, depending on how long you take exploring things and trying to get all the treasure chests and things like that scattered throughout the world. While I did everything significant there was to do in the game, I didn't go and get all of the collectibles, so if you're the kind of person who would go after those, then that will make you take a little bit longer. But generally speaking, you're looking at about a 5 to 6 hour game, and the last, say, 30 minutes to an hour or so of the game being kind of a pushover in the difficulty department really aren't enough to break it. I mean, the game is really more about exploring and investigating, not so much about hitting things or shooting things, and it really does show, because those are the parts that are truly interesting, and while the combat itself is alright, it never really becomes a problem even when you do actually have those issues with regards to it being a bit easy. It's the prime example of a game that is just right in terms of pacing. It is paced just right to where you feel like you're getting your money's worth. I mean, the mechanics don't wear out their welcome in that time, although I can see if it were to go too much further past that 6 or so hour mark, they would start to wear out their welcome a lot more, particularly considering that there's not all that much to do past the actual investigations and such, which are only going to take you about 5 to 6 hours anyway. So it's good that the game ends when it does, although again, the free roam mode is something that doesn't really need to exist. But ultimately, whether or not this is a great value is going to depend entirely on the type of player you are. If you're like me and you do like adventure games and you like exploring things to find out mysteries, then this is probably going to work out pretty well for you. If you don't like exploring things and having to use your brain to some degree and having to pay attention to sound cues, because there's actually a listening mechanic where you will hear whispers and fell sounds on the wind that will actually lead you to your next clue or the next stage of your investigation, and that does help to keep the pacing nice and strong, but not everybody's going to really like doing that. So if you aren't the kind of person that this game appeals to, you're probably not going to get much of anything out of it. In fact, you're probably going to get pretty pissed off at it because you'll feel like you just don't know where to go. You're like, what do I do? Where do I go? I need direction. And the game does give you some direction. It's just that you have to pay attention to it instead of it just directly telling you where to go. You know, like all those other first-person shooters that railroad you into things and just drag you along for the ride. This one doesn't really do that. It allows you to do things at your own pace, and if that's your kind of thing, you'll probably get a hell of a lot out of Betrayer. And ultimately, that's the camp I ended up falling into. It's a very immersive, very atmospheric game with some pretty interesting investigation, and while the ending does leave something to be desired due to the free roam being just a very gamey addition to it, it's still a very satisfying ride that is made all the more satisfying by the fact that you have to pay a lot more attention to what you're doing in this kind of game than you do in pretty much any other type of first-person shooter. And if that sounds like it would be interesting to you, I definitely recommend picking this one up. It's not a perfect game, but it's damn good at what it does. I give it a 4 out of 5. Thanks for watching.